Hello everyone. Welcome to our new series of Wednesday seminar. Before I start, I want to, as some of you know, I was on sabbatical and just came back, and I want to extend my great appreciation for Professor Dan Sheffield, who filled really nicely the role of the director of the center for a semester. Dan, would you stand up so we can have you? Thank you so much. So I'm a little bit rusty here, and so it will take a couple of weeks for me to get back to my old role. I'm Arzoo Osanloo. I'm the director of Bijan and Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. We usually have these seminars at noontime, and this time for our first meeting we decided to have it a little bit later in the afternoon so more people can come and hopefully have a bit of a longer conversation and discussion about the topic, which is one of the hottest debated topics of the past few months. And hopefully we'll be able to have a good conversation at the end of the presentation. Unfortunately, the weather was not cooperating with us, and our good friend and colleague, Professor Shirin Saeidi, who is a professor at the University of Arkansas, could not make it. There was an ice storm there, and all the roads were frozen. I lived in Atlanta for a few years, and I know these ice storms are pretty nasty, and they're not prepared to clean it up the way usually people in Minnesota or upstate New York are ready to clean up fast. So unfortunately, she is not with us here, but she'll be joining our meeting via Zoom after the presentation. The idea of this panel came at the end of last semester because, as I said, we realized that this is such an important topic that needs a lot of unpacking the events in Iran and unpacking in such a way that we go deeper to the roots and context and history of these events in Iran, and to be radical in our intervention. Radical in the sense of, in a sort of good old Marxian way, meaning going to the roots of events. And when we were thinking about this, two people that immediately came to mind were Professor Arzoo Osanloo from University of Washington and Professor Shirin Saeidi from University of Arkansas, both of whom have been working on the topics of gender, politics, law, society for many years, and have written about this topic in different scholarly journals, as well as participating in public conversations about this. So let me introduce our first speaker, Professor Arzoo Osanloo, who is a professor in the Department of Law, Society, and Justice, and the director of University of Washington's Middle East Center. She is also affiliated with the School of Law and Department of Anthropology, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, and Comparative Religion. And she does do administrative work for all these places. She earned her PhD in anthropology from Stanford University in 2002. And prior to that, she practiced law and received a JD from American University in 1993. As a former immigration and asylum refugee attorney, Professor Osanloo became concerned with the fraught but often neglected relationship between culture and rights. As a legal anthropologist, her research and teaching focus on the intersection of law, culture, and politics, including human rights and humanitarianism. Her research explores the formations of women's rights and human rights in cultural contexts and draws on continuing ethnographic work in Iran. Her first project explored the politicization of rights talk and women's subjectivities in post-revolutionary Iran and resulted in a fantastic book that I use in my own class, The Politics of Women's Rights in Iran, which was published by our own Princeton University Press in 2009. Her most recent book, Forgiveness Work, Mercy, Law, and Victims' Rights in Iran, which, by the way, won the prize for the best book award from Mossavar-Rahmani Center this past August. This was the inaugural prize for our center. The book is a nuanced ethnographic study of the Iranian criminal courts and the Islamic victim-centered approach to justice and conditions of mercy. I highly recommend both books. It's a very reader-friendly book. And without further ado, I would like to ask Professor Osanloo to come join us, and then later I will introduce Professor Saeidi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ahmadi. It's so nice to be here. It's so nice to do in-person events. I know many of the people here, and I've just met some, and it's just so very nice to have you here, and I appreciate your time. Just one thing before we start, I just want to say I did a sabbatical here at Princeton in 2011-12 at LAPA, the Law and Public Affairs program. At the time, there was no Iranian Studies program. And I just want to say that what Professor Rahmani has built here with 7 postdocs fully funded for 3 years if they want is amazing, and it has just blown the field of Iranian studies out of the water. We had some of the top scholars right here in Iranian studies. And if I may say, Dan Sheffield was at the University of Washington before he came here. So thank you. So I'm going to give a talk. I have to, not talk too much, but my talk is a little bit about my research. And then at the end, I want to offer a new argument, and I would love your feedback on it, and you can ask me any questions and challenge me and whatnot. So let me thank the center. Becky Parnian has been amazing, and my talk has 3 parts. The first is I'm going to talk a little bit about the state, then I'm going to talk about the women, a la, Chatterjee, and then I'm going to talk about the title of my talk, Challenging Benevolence, and all in, the remaining 2 minutes I have. No, I'm kidding. So, as Professor Rahmani pointed out, many news outlets all over the country and the world have been, pointing out the seeming spontaneity or suddenness of the uprisings in Iran. And some folks have tried to understand this as, whether it's a social movement or indeed a revolution. Others argue that the vehement responses to many of the forms of injustice and state violence in Iran are driven by provocateurs outside of the country, dushman. However, I want to consider that these uprisings not only originate from within Iran, but that the conditions of possibility for them exist within, and that the protesters draw on the very promises of the revolution that their parents and now grandparents before them fought for and were assured over 40 years ago. That is, their expectations are neither sudden nor unexpected, and nor are they outside of the conditions of possibility for the Islamic Republic of Iran. So I just want to give you a little snippet of a vignette, some people call it, when I was doing my research in Iran. I go back to Iran every year except for COVID, starting back in 1999. And in the summer of 2012, I was in Iran, and I woke up in the morning and I turned on, and I was watching regular TV, not satellite TV, and I noticed that the Islamic Republic of Iran had convened this first international conference on women and the Islamic awakening. And little did I mean, I knew, but it was like just down the street, but I didn't go. I was like, comfortable in my couch with my coffee. And this was in July, and they hosted female intellectuals and scholars from all over the world. The Iranian press boasted that the participation was of over 1,500 female researchers, scholars, and social activists from over 80 countries. They presented over 450 papers. Now, the president at the time, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, addressed the conference he opened the conference. And this part was broadcast live on national television on July 10th, 2012. And he spoke, he began by asking why the role of women is so important in Islam and what awakening means in this context. He spoke of women's unique capacities for loving kindness, muhabbat, compassion, nurturing, providing help, and respect. And he went on to say that women stand shoulder to shoulder with men. They provide the seat of love and kindness. And he went on and talked about what a big job women have in society and in reforming the world. Now, later, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, also addressed this conference and stated, the West tries to deprive women of their identity through an all-out effort that considers women to be commodities. And he said, Islam believes that a woman is honorable, dignified, and progressive, and believes that a woman has an independent character and identity. So for students of Iran and Iranian studies, you know that these remarks are very much in line with the kinds of remarks Ayatollah Khomeini made during his time as Iran's Vilayat Faqih. And in some of the things I quoted to you were actually statements that have been traced, Khomeini said himself in speeches that women stand shoulder to shoulder, a lot of the language. So to consider women's rights and roles in the Islamic Republic, we might turn to the revolutionary era and the promises afforded in these discourses that emphasized women's rights and elevated their status in society, or at least argued for it. At that time, revolutionary leaders used women's status as a primary locus of the revolution, quite literally, the site, the bodies, on which the nation's rehabilitation and therefore would take place, and therefore raised women's issues to be markers of the state's very legitimacy as well. Discourses about women's objectification stressed the need to focus on women's intellectual development. This, in turn, intensified the focus on women's education and productive social and political participation. Thus, the emphasis on women's status and their expectation of better treatment, dignity, and respect, not to mention equal rights, in the post-revolutionary era was of a piece with Khomeini's designation as women's status as central to the much broader aim of creating an Islamic government, hukumat Islami, politically, discursively, legally, and materially. Now, just after the revolution, the leaders of Iran's transitional government had a discussion, or discussions, of what to name this new political entity, right? And in preparation for the national referendum of March, they wanted to determine what the name of this new polity was. And different parties came up with different terms. Many of you know this story. Should we call it the Democratic Republic of Iran, the Democratic Islamic Republic of Iran, the, et cetera, and so forth. And as many of you know, Khomeini was very much against any title that had the term democratic in it. And he explained his reasoning for this, particularly in a very well-covered interview by Oriana Fallaci published in the New York Times, where he said, she asked him, what's wrong with the word democracy? And she said, to begin with, the word Islam doesn't need adjectives, such as democracy, precisely because Islam is everything. It means everything. And it is sad for us to have such a word near the word Islam, because Islam is perfection. Besides, this democracy, which you love so much and you consider so valuable, does not have any precise meaning. Aristotle's democracy is one thing, Soviet democracy is another, and we cannot afford to have such an ambiguous concept in our constitution. Now, Khomeini's response might give way to the suggestion that the naming of the new country, the Islamic Republic, as it was ultimately named, constituted a strategic formation, one highlighted in his, one of his very famous quotes, neither east nor west, in which he pointed out the need for Iran's political, social, and economic independence. Indeed, Khomeini's thoughts about democracy were actually about what democracy actually were is difficult to state with specificity because he himself seemed to lack a specific opinion on it, as he said to journalist Oriana Fallaci. Now, this antipathy to democracy and the idea that Islam holds answers to all questions notwithstanding, I argue that by placing women's issues and the improvements, promising improvements in their status as a primary revolutionary aim, these new leaders were now committing the post-revolutionary state to address women's concerns. And here I argue, it was not democracy in all of its abstraction that created spaces for women's rights, rather it was the ensuing republic, alongside of Islamic principles through which women and others came to seek remedies within the conditions that the Islamic Republic provided, if unwittingly, right? Now, regardless, we cannot escape the fact that women, or the status of women in that society, became important elements, and this resulted in their expectation of better lives. Now, when I started my graduate work in anthropology, I did so after reading about the situation of women. This was in the early 90s, so the publications were coming out in the 80s and early 90s. And much of that scholarship really sort of emphasized that women don't have rights, they've lost their rights, they're sent back inside the homes. And others, though, later, seeing that empirically this isn't actually what was happening, they said, no, women have rights. It's just that they're being construed through an Islamic framework. So I set about to understand how women in post-revolutionary Iran understood their rights, the women themselves. And because, as was mentioned, I was a previous lawyer, I thought, what better than to connect with lawyers and the courts to understand how women in Iran themselves are thinking about rights. And I want to say, in all of my years of sitting in almost 20 courts in Tehran, family court, criminal court, I would say that going to lawyers' offices throughout Tehran, also in that time, the one thing that was very, I should say, remarkable, that stood out to me, was just how unremarkable it was from the standpoint of somebody who practiced law, even if it was in the US, and somebody who was trained in law, not Islamic law, not Sharia law, just good old US of A law, common law, if you will. And this was underscored for me just weeks into my first 12-month ethnographic fieldwork in Iran. And I entered into an office of a lawyer, a female lawyer, who somebody had recommended I meet, who had been a lawyer before the revolution as well as after the revolution. And so here I was as graduate student, and I had my letter with Stanford letterhead, and I had my recommendation from this lawyer's good friend who lived in the United States, and I said, I'm here because I want to understand how women in Iran are seeking their rights through Islam. And without missing a beat, she said to me, well, I can't help you here. Here we have civil codes and civil courts. This is a law office, and I'm a lawyer. I don't deal in Islam. I deal in law. If you want to understand women's rights, you need to learn how the law works. And you need to go to court to see how women are getting their rights. Now, I was very surprised by this response, who told me that it was civil law and procedure, and not some generalized platitudes about, how Islam respects women, through which women were seeking redress for their grievances. Indeed, this attention to legal process emerged as a central focus of my research for what it reveals, not about disputing processes, which is what legal anthropologists do by and large, but what this revealed to me about the politics of rights and the operations of power and gender relations, especially subject formation or subjectivity. So I just want to skip a little bit that I've already kind of mentioned, but what I want to think about is in this idea of sort of improving women's status as one of the main aims of the revolution. I want to think about how the resulting government could now be held accountable for these promises. What's more, as a legitimating factor of the revolution, women's status could forever be tied to the state's very legitimacy. Now, of course, just what improvement means, or how it is to be achieved, is the substance of the struggles we're seeing today. And one of the earliest instances of these struggles we saw was in March 1979, which many of you are familiar with, when tens of thousands of women and men went into the streets to protest the then suspension of the family protection law, some possibility of disenfranchisement. That didn't happen, but the mandatory veiling laws, which did happen. But what was interesting is if you look at the nature of these protests, okay? Women at this time were holding up placards, calling for equality, calling for rights. What to me was interesting was what happened after. They were attacked. They were attacked for using the discourses of the Western imperialist forces, right? They were attacked for using this language. And this is what I mean when I talk about the politicization of rights talk. This language of rights at the time of the revolution came to be, was associated with Western imperialist excess, where language of rights was disassociated from women's status, from, just their relations in the family, the idea that women are the kiana khanavadeh, the jewel in the crown of the family. And so this was why I was so surprised when the lawyer I met in Iran in 1999 told me, we have civil codes and laws, and you need to understand how women are getting their rights. And I thought, wow, this is 20 years after the revolution, 20 years after these other women were attacked for using the language of rights. How is it that, you know, today you're all using the language of rights, going to court, talking about wanting your rights? How did that happen? So to understand the significance of making rights-based claims today, we want to recall Khomeini's thesis for Islamic government, Hukumat Islami, had no use for a lawmaking body. There was no need, he said, for man-made laws, as God's law would only matter. So it becomes significant that today, indeed, before today, 20, 30 years ago, despite Hukumat Islami, we have Jomhuriya Islami, the Islamic Republic, which retained the legislative branch of government and the civil courts and the civil codes as venues for adjudicating disputes, and civil codes are the formal expression of the law. So what this lawyer was pointing out to me was that all of these factors have tangible consequences for a system of rights. And all of this was done after, as I said, Khomeini had ostensibly nullified all these laws. So what we're seeing is a legal blending that disrupts the symmetry that used to exist between Sharia, and Qanun, or law. And now we're seeing for the first time that the civil codes, the codification, is giving Islamic principles the weight of law. And this is important because civil codes and civil procedures carry with them effects, subject-making effects. And there is, you know, tomes of scholarship in socio-legal studies about subject-making in US courts, in small rural towns, in big cities, in, you know, Great Britain. But what's interesting is that these effects make subjects, right? And the apparatuses of the republic, the institutions of the state, require subjects to operate as rights-bearing individuals, particularly when interacting with those institutions. So one of the consequences of this uneasy union between codification and Sharia, was in the family law codes. Women, many of you who may have lived in Iran know this, right? Women, if they wanted a divorce, they had to go to court. They had to make a case. They had to make use of the legal scaffolding. Initially, for the first, 10, maybe 20 years of the Islamic Republic, men didn't have to. So women became very savvy legal actors. And what we would say in legalese, they learned how to state a cause. They learned how to use the legal procedures to outline their claims in courts, how to invite witness testimony, how to proffer evidence. And in order to do all of this, because they're making a case vis-a-vis the state, not their husbands, against their husbands, but they're interacting with the state. And so this requires them to have a sensibility of an autonomous being endowed with rights. And in order to outline their cases in claims and courts, they needed to employ a rights-based understanding of their status in society, precisely what the revolution had cautioned against. So in the end, it was Islamic principles that came to accommodate a Republican framework. And as it did, it produced, and I would say re-authenticated liberal subjects in various segments of society, but especially in the legal segments of society. Even in the Islamic Republic, even if the Islamic Republic made women the grounds on which political disputes over sovereignty were fought, the effects of those disputes were forms that were conspicuously liberal through the nation-state formation of a republic. The institutions of the state comprise the tangible apparatuses of everyday life and shape sensibilities, affect, subjectivity, and ultimately practice. So I want to skip ahead and cut to the chase, probably, right? What I think I want to just end this section on, this is the second section, the women's section, and then I'll get to them, is that I have a really good paragraph I want to read it. Sorry. It's really good. It's worth it. So I'll just say what it is. I can't find it. What was imprecise was not democracy. What the author of Hukumat-e Islami did not understand was Jumhuri, was republic, and the kinds of effects that a republic state framework alongside Islamic principles or any Christian principles would ultimately have on subjects. Now, I want to go back, now this is the last 5 minutes, to my title, Challenging Benevolence, Iran, Iranian Women, Revolutionary Movement for Rights in Iran, and Beyond. Because I want to talk about this debate. Is this revolution? Why aren't you saying it's a revolution? Why are you calling it uprising? It's a revolution. And many people from political theorists can argue about that, but I want to say something I find is very revolutionary about what's happening in Iran, and I think it is something beyond just Iran. I think we're seeing a very important claim that is being made by women on behalf of women. 20 years after the revolution, we saw one of the first uprisings in Salam newspaper was closed. Students in their dormitories who protested were attacked. And they asked for Khatami, the reformist president, the rule of law president. We want Khatami. And the rumor was, I was in Iran at the time, he's afraid. And I feel like this was a moment of reckoning for Iranians with the limits of what their government would allow for republic. Because it was the first time many people realized Khatami was afraid. Why is he afraid? He's the president, elected by 76% or 80% of eligible voters. The president of the Islamic Republic of Iran has no police force to protect him. And here we see the limits of this Republican framework. And I would argue that since that time, we have seen the undermining of the possibilities of the Republic, right? And today's protests challenge the ever-becoming Hukumat-e Islami. And this is so as much for reformists who drew on so-called dynamic interpretation of the sacred texts, as it is for the principalists who hewed closer to Khomeini's legacy. But it would be facile to suggest that this is just about these few people who are going to courts, that I studied, when we see thousands of people. And that's what I think is revolutionary. There's a much broader framework that people are challenging, which goes actually to my second book project, the book project on mercy. And it goes to the beginning of my talk, this emphasis on mehrabuni, this, let's be compassionate. I have no problem with compassion, right? But it is not compassion that is the basis or benevolent of an egalitarian society, right? Compassion and benevolence rely on, depend on, and actually re-entrench inequality, right? And the broad claims, quest for humanitarianism, benevolence, charity, everything from the care work that we see in the United States for healthcare, to Iran, or whether it's humanitarian care, or let's give to the poor people in Africa. All of this is a post-Cold War eclipsing of rights consciousness, rights discourse, human rights claims that we as individuals have against the state in favor of they allowing the state and the people who are the wealthy owners of the wealth, who are not part of the state, we are always and forever in their questing their good graces so that we can be recipients of their benevolence. And I've been teaching human rights for all of this time, and what I'm seeing is that there has been an eclipse of human rights talk. Louis Henkin in 1995 famously published this book about how this is the age of rights. And I would argue that today we're seeing the age of benevolence, not just in Iran. But what's amazing to me is that 4 decades after the Iranian Revolution and the creation of the Islamic Republic, these generations, post-revolutionary generations, have seen it and have felt it and are reclaiming it in a way that we should all stand up and take notice. Thank you. 30 minutes. Not including your introduction. Sorry, Shirin, if I talked too much.
Maybe if we have time, we can read that paragraph.
I'll look for it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Arzoo. Again, with great regret that Professor Saeidi could not be here in person, Dr. Shirin Saeidi, Assistant Professor of Political Science and the Director of the King Fahd Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Arkansas. We just recently learned that in Arkansas they do have ice storms. Professor Saeidi earned her PhD in politics and international relations from Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. She has published numerous articles. She's quite prolific in writing and book chapters, and her writing has appeared in Gender and History, Journal of Gender and History, Citizenship Studies, International Journal of Middle East Studies, and International Studies Review, and many others. Her very important book just came out in last year in 2022 from Cambridge University Press. We were privileged to have a book launch for Professor Saeidi here. The title of the book is Women and the Islamic Republic, How Gendered Citizenship Conditioned the Iranian State. The book is based on extensive interviews and oral histories as well as archival research, and where she challenges the dominant masculine theorizations of state-making in post-revolutionary Iran. Professor Saeidi has been on the editorial board of Journal of Citizenship Studies since 2014 and advisory board of the Journal of International and Global Studies. And again, with many thanks, Shirin, for participating in our conversation. I think we have your image here, and can you hear us well?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear it, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay, so the screen is yours, and with many thanks again.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there. This was like the highlight of my year. I was so excited, and then there was this ice storm. I'm really sorry to miss all of you. The paper I'm presenting today has evolved a bit since I submitted my abstract. Currently, it's a couple of papers that I'm co-authoring with friends and colleagues that I have put together. One paper, I explore how the events of September 2022 have caused me to really reevaluate what I know, how I know it, what that knowledge means And there's an element, a discussion of legibility there, which I'm going to talk about. And then there's another paper I'm writing with a colleague about the different axes of experience and interpretation in the current uprising, particularly in the diaspora. And in that piece, we're trying to understand how the Iranian American diaspora could be more supportive or constructive to the people of Iran broadly. Okay, so the refusal to be legible. Between 2007 to 2014, I conducted field work in Iran to understand how non-elite women, not connected to women's rights movements or the government, transform the state. I decided to cover the history of citizenship of different social groups, including Islamist, leftist, and secular non-elite women. This project took me from Cambridge, where I was writing my doctoral dissertation, to Tehran, where I settled down and taught for 2 years upon graduating in 2012. Women in the Islamic Republic, How Gender Citizenship Conditions the Iranian State, my first book, developed out of those experiences. Experiencing different kinds of vulnerabilities in my life after field work, including becoming a mother and watching a steady stream of colleagues arrested and incarcerated in Tehran, I decided it was no longer wise for me to travel to my country of birth. Then September 2022 happened and challenged me to think about the political and its possibilities in flight. The September 22 death in custody of a 22-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, sparked an uprising in Iran that has continued for over 100 days throughout many cities. Protesters shouted slogans against the Islamic Republic and destroyed images of the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, as well as images of the founder of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. According to some high-ranking state officials, the average age of protesters was only 15 years old. And between September 16th and November 1st, at least 1,158 out of 1,265 protests were led by women. There are axes of difference in the experience and in the interpretation of the uprising. And I use the term uprising to really mean rising up in that sense. There is one axis emergent on the feminist, non-feminist differences. For instance, Elle, whose essay was translated but written anonymously, states the following on why Iran's uprising is a feminist one. What distinguishes this uprising as feminist is this figure-centered character, the possibility of creating images that do not necessarily capture the intensity of conflict, the cruelty of repression, the unfolding of events, but instead carry the history of bodies. Images of young Iranian women, sometimes quite young, even teenagers, displaying joy, softness, eloquence in the face of brutal violence, reclaimed the oppressed and humiliated female body in modern Iranian history to assert that another kind of world is possible. There is no desire to decipher the details of an event or political plans for the future. Instead, attention is drawn to the durability of the feminine across time and space in the reach of violence. In the images of women's bodies during the 2022 uprising that Elle discusses, she insists that there emerges a desire among women not to be read as individuals. Their images instead demonstrate the coming together of women's history with state repression and the life-reinforcing capacities of their bodies in Iran and beyond. Other Iranian analysts view the uprising as being led not necessarily by feminists with a gendered vision or agenda, but instead by marginalized citizens who have been consistently neglected by the state. There are some within the non-feminist front that see woman life freedom as having transformed into a masculine and somewhat violent movement that also participated in the killing and injuring of security and police agents. The radical transformation that woman life freedom proposed was not necessarily accepted by everyone in Iranian society. Some Iranians may prefer another formulation of the reform authoritarian politics that still remains similar to the past form of governance. It is important for analytical but also strategic reasons that we do not underplay the strong resistance to change that coexists with the radical imaginations at work in Iran today. Debates surrounding the feminist, non-feminist character of the September 2022 uprising are one of the axes of difference in experience and interpretation. The second axis that has developed is a nationalistic, transnationalistic one. Some writers have highlighted the history of feminist activism in modern Iran to locate the uprising in the country's struggle against modern repressive states, a movement that has lessons for the world. By remembering various campaigns, such as the Million Signature Campaign, these writers celebrate the many years of labor and sacrifice that Iranian women offered to create this particular moment of political transition. Other analysts not only recognize the national roots of this movement, but also give significant attention to the sanctions against Iran that are disproportionately impacting non-elite women. The nationalistic, transnationalistic writing acknowledges the connection between Iran and the international system, but from perspectives of slightly different nationalist readings. A third axis that has emerged is one that compares and highlights similarities between what is happening inside Iran and the broader movement of state regulation of women's bodies and sexuality in other countries, including democratic ones. As the editors of the International Journal of Feminist Politics asked in a recent issue inspired by Iran's woman life freedom movement, why are states across the ideological spectrum so invested in regulating sexuality, gender, and women's lives? Nargis Bajghori suggests that Iran's September uprising was about women's bodily autonomy, and in that sense, it is intimately connected to women's rights struggles in the United States, India, and Afghanistan. Within the same axis, some have noted the presence of two different emerging women life freedom movements, one inside Iran and the other in the diaspora. Zani Irani argues that the woman life freedom movement in New York has repoliticized groups such as the monarchists and the Mujahideen, both of which have coordinated their activities with the US government. However, inside Iran, protesters have not yet declared any alliances with alternative political options. This is another illustration, along with the images of figures discussed above, of a desire among some Iranians in the country to remain illegible to everyone attempting to read them. This perspective tends to emphasize the differences between the national and international movements centering on women's rights generally and women life freedom movements in particular. My main point in today's lecture is that politics also lives at the intersections of these axes where new possibilities emerge. The desire to make Iranians legible disrupts the overlaps in experiences and interpretations at these axes, and the refusal to be read by some Iranians is a deafening silence that has destabilized how many think about gender rights struggles, state politics, and the future of the international system. Separating these intersections also happens to undermine the collective effort needed for transformation to occur because of the experiences with trauma in post-1979 Iran. Mahsa Ruhi highlights the centrality of trauma to Iranian experiences with revolution, war, migration, and state security politics in post-1979 Iran. It is at the intersection of loss, national and transnational politics that various interpretations of and engagements with woman life freedom, the woman life freedom uprising, are expressed and must be studied. I write this essay in the spirit of rupturing the intrusive practice of forced legibility among us. I do so by identifying an injury we have experienced, being misread, being force read, and offering Iranian diasporic writing as a medium for communication to relocate ourselves not only in the back and forth movement between each other, but also in Iran and elsewhere. Iranian diasporic writing also pushes forth national healing by reflecting on translation between spaces and places as well as Iranians and language. I concentrate on how, among the many possibilities, my own position as a diasporic researcher makes me think of a specific form of reading, interpreting Iranian unrest through the lens of illegibility. This is not to suggest, however, that all Iranians wish to be illegible or that I know what Iranians in the country are working toward. For instance, in her writing, Elle is a good example of the possibilities of being a legible feminist. It is also the case that many Iranians wish to be legible. Some locate themselves in the mainstream terms of revolutionaries, pro-democracy, nationalists, Islamists, etc. Being legible can be useful, especially since one cannot escape the multiple axes of difference. However, it is not the only way of living or struggling. As a scholar that strongly opposes both war and sanctions, I found myself in the middle of this battle in the diaspora, where many of us who are involved in civil rights work as Iranian Americans and in our community were targeted by known and unknown elements within the opposition. Statements such as, "You do not represent us," were heard by some in the opposition movement in the diaspora. Factions within the opposition also expressed their sense of moral duty to be the voice of the Iranian people. In the middle of this chaos, a friend texted me an article from Fars News, a news agency closely aligned with the Iranian state. The article named my book, Women in the Islamic Republic, as the blueprint behind the September 2022 uprising. Exhausted by the misreading, I began to consider an idea that for me reframes the politics of misrepresentation. Within the Iranian diaspora and in the Islamic Republic, there is an insistence on making one's politics legible, especially if you are politically active. Hence the battle over who can serve as the voice or representative of not only those inside Iran, but also outside the country. Yet thus far, the Iranian people, the protesters, and their supporters have avoided being read, and by bypassing being legible as opposition, as contest, as violent, as powerful. While factions within the diaspora and within the Islamic Republic, certainly not all, desperately seek to offer a neat and clean story about what's happening in Iran, the reality is that the Iranian people are breaking new ground in how we think, imagine, and manifest comprehensive political transformations. During this panel discussion, I would like to think with you about what it means to refuse legibility, especially about the current strategies and visions that one holds. The silence surrounding this issue challenges our thinking and offers a possible way out of the cycle of insecurity we experience with one another between the diaspora and Iran. The political move to force legibility guides the framework of the Islamic Republic, and shortly thereafter, segments of the diaspora used to decipher the nature and possible outcomes of the uprisings. Asif Bayat's groundbreaking conceptualization of social non-movements helped us fully appreciate the dispersed acts of resistance that scholars witnessed in the Middle East and North Africa. This concept moves beyond the visible politics of resistance, such as Iranian women pushing their mandatory scarves further and further back following the rise of reformist politics. Instead, Bayat builds on his insightful and emotionally engaged observations of Iranian society in the 1979 revolution, as well as Egypt's social transformations during the Arab uprising. What Bayat homes in on are the built-in mechanisms for the power of presence in the ordinary, mundane, everyday life of a society under moral, political, and military surveillance. Other scholars have also noted the power social struggle holds against the violation of citizenry rights, despite it lacking the structure of a formal movement. For example, in Heavy Metal Islam, Mark Levine demonstrates how youth who produce and enjoy forbidden music in the Middle East and North Africa rely on a disorganized, embedded, and non-oppositional presence in society that makes the great population a constant concern for the state. What Bayat and Levine depict are peaceful, collective, coordinated, spontaneous presences that blur the boundaries between movement, reform, and revolution. I am not looking to debate the accuracy of Bayat's theory in relation to the current situation in Iran, and I address the complexities concerning and concerns associated with the notion of social non-movement elsewhere. Instead, what I find urgent to understand is why social non-movement is the main conceptual framework used to understand the Iranian uprising at this moment, especially by those inside the country. With over dozens of books deciphering gender, social movements in Iran, as well as many recent works on democracies, authoritarianism, revolutions, and protests, more broadly, why have academics based in Iran and activists abroad gravitated toward this particular explanation of woman life freedom? Bayat's most impactful analysis of the situation in Iran was conducted as an interview, which was published October 2022 by Etemad, a leading reformist newspaper. Shortly thereafter, the interview was banned and removed by authorities in Tehran, but by that point it had already circulated in the diaspora through social media. In the interview, Bayot stresses that by reclaiming the streets, the youth, along with other segments of society, may achieve their democratic goals. He challenges notions of progress and the power of disorganized activism, and refuses to make any predictions about what is to come. What I'm arguing in a forthcoming paper is that in many ways his work, I believe, has been co-opted by groups associated with white supremacy or the state in Iran to offer us a particularly, a kind of narrative that makes activists, especially those abroad, feel that they're moving towards some kind of progress. So in that piece, I'm talking about co-option of the scholarship of Native scholars and how that is done and with what intention. As Iskandar Sadeghi convincingly asserts in a forthcoming article, the Woman Life Freedom Uprising must be studied at the intersect of 40 plus years of disorganized and organized social movements, and a state in crisis that is steadily narrowing its social base, and a neoliberal economic system of governance that consistently marginalizes populations not connected to the regime. The Iranian people have lived through turmoil and loss through political formulations that overlap the national and international system of governance. As such, I argue that they have every reason to hold little regard for legibility politics as a defining character of popular responses to the uprising. With their refusal to be read, they appear to be searching for original and creative solutions that will also change how the world thinks about politics. And that's where I think a lot of times Bayot's work is gravitated towards, because it gives this feeling, at least, that one can read exactly what's happening and what the outcome of it can be. And I just find that very interesting, how social groups that really oppose one another are kind of using the same strategy. So I'm interested to understand that. What I find striking and somewhat overlooked in the woman life freedom movement in the diaspora is the protesters' call for freedom as an explicit avoidance of revolutionary or reformist political alignments. If we think about what is not legible, what we do not see, feel, or hear, then we are forced to ponder on the possibility that the uprising may not be about reform or revolution. Instead, it could be a cry for living and struggling differently. If protesters are not seeking to overthrow government buildings or even pursuing a strategy of assembling near them to express grievances, perhaps it is because the state is not their main or at least only focus. Maybe they are interested in redefining the power dynamics between state and society in a way that, through a redefined concept of citizenship, citizens can come to define governance and not the other way around. My book would suggest this to be the logical outcome of 40 plus years of organized and disorganized women's rights activism, which the state was forced to catch up to over and over again. As de Beauvoir rightly claims, the September 2022 uprising is not about replacing one group of elites with another, as is the norm in non-feminist revolutions. As such, something entirely original might be happening in Iran that is being missed by our desire to read and categorize one another. The demand for being left alone to live can be understood as one description of what woman life freedom means to Iranian protesters. How would our activism and research change if we could throw out the literature review that keeps us stuck between reform and revolution? What if, instead of trying to fit the voices of protesters into our own bodies as their spokesperson, or force their bodies and images into established academic literature, we listen long and hard to what they are saying while keeping the intellectuals out of this part of the movement, and instead listen to activists on the ground as they theorize their own future. I have argued in this short essay that the pursuit of legibility among some opposition elements in the diaspora and within the Islamic Republic has led to violence against those who refuse to be legible in the post-2022 Woman Life Freedom Uprising. The insistence to categorize people and know exactly what the future holds evolves from a sense of insecurity experienced by traumatized communities, as well as a feeling displayed by a state in crisis. I suggest that by letting go of an insistence to dominate and master the future, we can better understand the political lessons that the people of Iran, both inside the country and in the diaspora, are teaching the world. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Shirin. We have 25 minutes for questions. Please try to ask question. If you have comments, make the comment very short and formulate your questions in a clear way so we can have a conversation about it. 1 or 2 questions, good for every member of the audience. And so let me open the floor. I take the questions and then you can ask Professor Saeidi or Professor Osanloo. Yes.
Hi, my name is Onur Günay. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology and I teach courses on Middle East anthropology, etc. So, two of my colleagues, Özlem Göner and let me find the name, just a second. Farangis Kaderi wrote an article saying why Jinnah, erasure of Kurdish women and their politics from the uprisings in Iran. So, and they talk about the entire I'm a scholar of Turkey and Kurdistan, and I know this slogan from the Kurdish liberation movement, from the PKK, and I'm not saying that it can change the entire significance of the protests of Iran, but Özlem Göner and Faris Kaderi argue that there is a systematic erasure of not only the names, but also where the slogans come and the meaning of the origins of the slogan and where it started. And since you both mentioned that, but since there was no discussion about it, I wonder what you think about their points, because it also fits into the larger erasure of Kurdish politics and Kurdish women's politics in Syria, in Turkey, in Iran, in Iraq, and the larger Middle East. So what do you think about it?
I should let Shirin answer that because it's very much on her topic, but I would just say that I agree with you. And I think that if in a smaller context, we could see that this is also a way in which elite women, let's say in the urban context, or privileged women in Tehran may go and make those claims. But there are people who would also argue against me for other reasons. Maybe Shirin, you want to speak to that too.
I'm so sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
Oh, that's right. You're supposed to restate that.
Okay, now it's going to be a challenge, and you're all going to witness my failure here. How I repeat the question.
Erasure of Kurdish women.
Yes, the origin of the slogan goes back to. No, you can hear me. You can hear me, right?
So
Yes.
Yeah. The origin of the slogan "Women like freedom" goes back to Turkish struggle, the Kurdish struggle, and Kurdish women's struggle, and we see that possibly in representations of this movement or in the conversation today, that history is erased, and how can we recover that history in such a way that make these connections and to see what the roots of this slogan is and how recognizing that root changes the narrative about what's going on in here. How did I do that?
That was wonderful. Thank you.
I think that's a really excellent question. Several things come to mind. I was just talking about this with a colleague, and we were both saying, and this is part of what I'm writing in one of the papers that sort of came out of this whole getting ready for the Princeton talk. Increasingly, I just feel, even though I've written a book on Iran and done all of this research, I just feel very insecure about what I know. I don't think I know anything anymore. And part of that is actually because I know so little about the Kurdish struggle. And so I think for some academics, and I don't talk about things that I don't know. So I just want to tell you that first up front. I think part of the issue is that some scholars are just have not studied that in depth to be able to contribute as much as we really should be. The second issue is that a lot of what's been happening in the diaspora in Iran is sort of displaying woman-like freedom as this, and I agree in large part, it's beautiful, it's about liberation, but there's also very strong misogynist, sexist. We saw, for instance, that when in the diaspora they were creating sort of this opposition front, that minorities were left out of it, and this is like in the diaspora where they think they are the voice of freedom. And so that history of racism, of sexism, of oppression of minorities, I mean, it's not just from the state, it exists in our society and in our community, so that needs to be addressed. And I do think there's another issue though. I don't think that we can study politics just based on slogans. I'm very uncomfortable with making analysis purely based on what people are saying in protest. As a researcher, I would need to do more in-depth work inside the country, talking to participants. Now, I don't necessarily mean this in relation to the Kurdish struggle. I mean it in terms of many people saying that this is a feminist uprising. Well, I really wonder, you know, are the different men that are participating, do they identify as feminists? What happens in the long term in their personal lives? So there's a lot of questions that I think that need to be answered that it's just difficult to do from a distance through social media. So I think I'll stop there.
My question is for Arzoo. So I wonder to what extent, because you were saying that the most sort of, the people on the street right now are kind of continuing to sort of live out, or they basically asking for the revolution to like uphold its promises in a way, but I wonder to what extent the Gen Z is just alien from that memory. Like how, like it seems like there's a distance between Gen Z and 1979 that's even vaster than between millennials in 1979. And so when I think of sort of how, let's say you're Gen Z, you're like 16, 17, and you are arrested, or you have to go to court, or you have to sort of talk to an officer, like of course I know how to behave in a courtroom, but I also know double consciousness. Like I know that I also want to burn this place down. So there's like, I wonder, so there's a kind of, there's a sort of way in which one can be made into a subject, but I wonder how much of that might be learning a code that you do not identify with.
Thank you for that question. I feel like I could see why you would say that I'm saying that they're trying to get the revolution to uphold their promises, but what I'm more interested in is that the language that they're using and the way they're envisioning themselves as rights-bearing, as autonomous, grew out of the revolutionary promises, and that is surprising, it seems, to the members of the state who are opposed to that. But I agree with you that that kind of subject position it's not static, right? Maybe it's different in different contexts. Many of us are familiar with the work of Sabah Mahmood, right? And I always said, I would love to see her interlocutors, how do they behave when they want to get a divorce, right? I mean, people inhabit different subject positions in different venues in different zones. So I don't think it's an all-encompassing kind of essentialization. But what I'm saying is that these claims for rights that were so suspicious to the people who had this revolution, now the same language is being used, but this time it's language that they themselves have not just allowed, but have allowed to be produced through the very system. So just one quick example, when I was doing my research and I went into the Islamic Republic, Islamic Human Rights Commission in Iran, which is actually, there's a long story about how that came to be, and it's now kind of on the outs with the government. But when I went to talk to them, and they have their own, Islamic Declaration of Human Rights, I said, well, like how are these different from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? And the woman, legal scholar, said to me, oh no, they're not different. We've just studied them, and we have found them to be not not in conformity. So they're in conformity, so they're kind of re-authenticated. So I found that very interesting that, like, now we're here, we've studied these documents, it's okay to talk about human rights. You know, it's okay to talk about women's rights. And now they do, and the effect is, we're gonna shut you down because, oh, we didn't really expect that you would start challenging this system. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Osanloo. I think if my understanding is not correct, please correct me. I had a feeling that from what you were talking about, and as I also sort of subscribe to this, this should not be a surprise. The uprising should not be. There are, as you said, throughout 40-something years of 40 plus years, 43 years after the revolution, we've had different institutions, organized, unorganized social movements that have basically led to where we are today. But also, I guess I'm curious to know what exactly has changed. What unexpected aspects of this uprising do you have in mind? I mean, is there anything unexpected to you, based as a scholar who has studied, all these changes that people have gone through and the society has actually gone through, and now we are where we are? What is different from previous uprisings? And yeah, I guess I'm curious just to know also your personal opinion on that, maybe what surprised you about this one?
Do I have opinions? Somebody asked me this before, and at the end I'll tell you what I said, because I'm surprised. I don't nothing. I know someone from these surprised. No, that's not the case. But so when I talked about that salon, that uprising, and this and that, what happened, and I was in my little apartment in Iran, and I had a journalist friend who was covering it, and he would come back and he would say, what's going on, and he said, oh, it was really, really interesting. Today this happened, or and he said, this woman, she pulled at her manteau and said, in 20 years, this is what you've given us. And he said, this is 1999. The thing is, though, nobody's willing to die for this. And here we are 20 years later, it's like, whoa, people are fed up, right? And I don't think it's one thing, but it's an accumulation of things. And what I have seen, and what all of you who study Iran have seen, in this intervening 20 years, there's always something, right? Well, there's the war with Iraq. Oh, there's, the revolution. Finally, Khatami comes along and he's like, rule of law, everybody's happy. They even said to us, come back, we won't treat you badly, come back. And then people start making use of the very system that was put in place. People were born, generations were born and educated in this very system, and they're just doing what the system has offered them, has given them, and at every turn, they're being shut down. And I think it's this meeting, which, as I said, I maybe other people have different opinions, I'd love to hear them. I really located at this Salam uprising that happened, where the people said, okay, Jumhuri Islami, Islamic Republic, is a concept that is very limited, as much as we're pushing for it to become what a republic is. They're pushing back and undermining that aspect of it. But by then, what's that saying? The train had already left the station, or you know what I mean? So to me, it's the accumulation of decades and decades and decades of not just humiliation, but also aspiration, right? Like all these educated people, all these experts, all this knowledge. And you're, like my friend, like one of my friends, interlocutor, she was a swimming coach. And she said to me, you know, the Constitution, they refer to fad. Fad. Fad is what? An individual. I'm quoting her. An individual. I mean, this woman thinks of herself not as wife of, daughter of, relational status, right? Remember Henry May? She thinks of herself as an individual endowed with rights. She has expectations. So in that regard, the accumulation of all of this expectation has not surprised me. The crushing of it has not surprised me. And you know, somebody asked me what is surprising to you, and I don't know if I want this on film. The stupidity. The government not giving 1 quarter, right? We will not give 1 quarter. And like, I wish I could advise them and say, you know, okay, forget that. Maybe Shirin, you wanted to say something?
We are kind of getting close. I wanted to put you and Shirin in conversation for a second on that question of legibility. Because in so many different ways, you deal with the question of legibility in terms of the construction of the individual subject and how they present themselves to a legal system that recognizes and doesn't recognize them. And for Shirin, it's a little bit of a broader question of legibility, that how does this movement make itself known to themselves and to the rest of the world, and the question of representation of this movement, this protest. So how do we kind of come to terms with this question of legibility, and how the attempts to legibility goes back to transform the subject itself? Does that make sense? It's a hard question.
Let's have Shirin. It makes sense to her.
Shirin takes it.
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think that it should. I mean, I think that it should cause us to reconsider, all of us, to reconsider our subjectivity. And as we, I mean, for me, when all of, you know, the sort of the attacks started and then that article came out, the initial thing I thought about was, well, you know, for years I did field work and research, and I was trying to read people, and that's sort of what I did. And of course, I always was aware of this, and I was, you know, I consider myself a student of Edward Said and Hamid Dabashi, so I was aware of the problematics associated with doing field work in Iran and writing in the United States. So I created all of these different ways to keep myself in check and all of that. But again, that doesn't stop you from having to do it over and over again all the time, depending on the transformations around you. So I want to pick up, I think, what Arzoo just said about the stupidity of the Islamic Republic. I'll say it really loud. The stupidity of the Islamic Republic is that they're not willing to think about their subjectivity as a state, their identity as a state. They are just repeating sort of the same patterns of the past and placing so many people in so much danger. And so I think a healthy person, I think a person that's committed to justice and you know, all of that would definitely want to reconsider their subjectivity in light of what's happening. And that includes everyone. So, you know, the opposition, the supporters, and everybody in between. I don't think we can escape that question.
Thank you both so much. I would say the easier question, I think. But also gets you a conversation. So I was really intrigued by both of your talks.
Could you speak louder? Oh, a little bit louder. He'll repeat that.
He's going to repeat it. I can't project that.
Yeah.
I'm very pregnant. I was really interested by your talks. You talked about women vis-a-vis the law, and Shirin, you talked about the legibility and illegibility of tiny narratives and symbols in the diaspora versus within Iran. And so the entire time I was just thinking about the expulsion of Iran from the UN Women's Commission, which became such a thing in diaspora, right? And there was such a tidy narrative around that. But what do we actually make of that? What were the implications of that? And then, like, how to actually do it? What was the significance of that? And my friend likes to keep pointing out to me that Afghanistan is still on the commission, right? So, like, what is the role of the commission to begin with? And why was this such a galvanizing point for people?
Questions?
That's my question. I think it was easier.
Did you hear it? Shirin?
Yes, I did hear the voice.
So the question for those of you in the back is that how can we make sense of this sort of very tight narrative about the campaign to kick Iran out of, expel Iran from the United Nations Women Commission, and what are the implications of that, and what is the politics behind it? What are the consequences, considering that, for example, Afghanistan is still a member of this commission, but Iran was expelled from it?
Do you want to go? Or I can just say a little bit briefly. I think, Shirin is the expert on looking at diasporic mobilization, and I feel that the work that we see to expel Iran from the UN Commission on Women. Okay, I'm not going to compare it to Santos, but it comes to mind. The idea is more of a project for the diaspora than it is for Iran. So as long as I've been going to Iran and I've talked to judges and lawyers and members of the government, they say, we do our own, right? And it is a question for what this entity, this enterprise, the Commission on Women is, what the aims are, what the goals are. I'm not well enough versed in to speak about the consequences of this, but there is a symbolic kind of punishing that's happening, but then again, there's no engagement. And so you have to kind of think about what are the costs and benefits of that. But the ultimate, I would say, success is the success of members of the diaspora who want whatever they want, whether it's regime change or a different kind of monarch, whatever. I'm not sure what the effects are inside of Iran, if any.
Yes, I agree with Arzoo. I think the danger in these sorts of projects is that expelling people, closing embassies, this shuts down the space for engagement. It shuts down the space for some level of accountability. And so, as far as I know as a political scientist, when you don't rely on diplomacy, and diplomacy is supposed to be used with people that you disagree with, it's not something you necessarily do with people that you agree with. So if we close down the option of diplomacy in these sorts of engagements, then what is left is really sanctions and war. It's other measures for getting those points across. So therefore, I personally find them very problematic and disagree with it. And there was a question about how does this contribute to people's lives in Iran? So a lot of these projects might to us look like they don't have much of an effect. But when I was doing research with religious women associated with the state, so much of their thinking and politics in their political life, but also in their intimate life, transforms with these sorts of engagements where, as Arzoo said in her presentation, things become okay because now we're addressing it. So, okay, I just want you to address it as a person who wants Iran to progress and women to have rights all of that. I just want you to address it. And if that's the channel that it's coming to you, that's fine with me. So I don't know any other way for change except these sort of small steps of encounters, engagement, dialogue, and people reconsidering and rethinking about their subjectivity. I don't know how else this could be done. And if we close down these paths, I feel like we are going to be, in some ways, it's like turning the gun on ourselves. And so I refuse to turn the gun on people of my own nation, or anyone really, but definitely not my own people. And so that's my answer.
So thank you so much, Professor Osanloo and Professor Saeedi, and thank you all for coming. Next week, we are going back to our regular schedule of noontime lectures. We have invited, the Canadians are coming next week. Professor Leila Kurtawaf is coming from York University in Toronto. She'll be talking about slavery in late 19th century, in the Qajar period. So this is the Black History Month, and we have a couple of events that sort of brings the Black History Month to Iranian studies. So please make sure that you come to our next week's talk. And we are going to have lunch also there available, and that's another incentive for you. And again, thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.